Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. One of the fundamental principles of water is that it seeks a level surface. If the water level at one end of this lake goes up 1 meter, then it will also have to rise 1 meter at the other end of the lake. The same thing is true with the oceans because they're all interconnected. It's possible to have minor variations from place to place due to wind or localized heating, but any large-scale changes to sea level seen in one place on Earth would necessarily be seen every place else as well. Unfortunately, though, climate hysteria has nothing to do with science. Alarming map shows American South sea levels rapidly rising. The problem is already affecting thousands of Americans living along the coast, and millions more across the U.S. will feel it in the coming decades. Climate change is steadily rising sea levels around the world, but the Gulf of Mexico is rising faster than almost every place else in the world. It's irreversible, a climate scientist at the University of Arizona told the Washington Post. That's a fascinating theory, particularly given that many of these cities aren't actually on the Gulf of Mexico. In order to understand what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to go back almost 100 years. 1927 was a very bad year for weather disasters. The worst flooding in U.S. history occurred along the Mississippi River in 1927, and this photograph shows historic flooding which occurred in New England that year as well. The Red Cross serviced 111 disasters that year, which was nearly one every 3 days. These disasters included 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, and 9 hurricanes. St. Louis, Missouri was largely wiped out by a tornado during September 1927. Flooding in Vermont during November 1927 washed out more than 1,000 bridges and drowned the lieutenant governor. And as I mentioned earlier, the worst flooding in U.S. history occurred along the Mississippi River for 6 months during 1927. After the flooding was over, lots of dikes and levees were built in order to keep the water away from the large cities. In doing so, they disrupted the geology of the region. Sediment which used to wash out into the Gulf of Mexico now settled upstream. This image is a geologic cross-section of the Gulf of Mexico along this line. Pretty much all of these sediments were deposited as silt from the Mississippi River. The weight of the new silt coming down the river pushes the sediments in the Gulf of Mexico downwards. There used to be an equilibrium where new silt coming down the river would replenish the sinking land. But building the levees and dikes disrupted that equilibrium. By reducing the amount of silt coming down the river via the use of levees and dikes, the land is no longer being replaced. The land is still sinking along the Gulf Coast, but the soil is no longer being replaced like it used to be from floods. So because of those dikes and levees, the cities along the edge of the Gulf Coast are sinking. When people choose to disrupt the normal cycles of nature, there are almost always side effects and consequences. One of the reasons why people live along the edge of these rivers is because of the very good soils there for farming. And those good soils which people farm in were deposited by annual floods year after year for millions of years. And there is an additional problem along the Gulf of Mexico and east coast of the United States, which even the New York Times knows about. Overpumping of groundwater is causing the land along the east coast and Gulf coast of the United States to sink. The New York Times reports that Atlantic City, New Jersey is sinking up to 4 centimeters per decade. Nearby groundwater pumping has caused soils to compact. Charleston, South Carolina, which is affected by groundwater pumping, is sinking up to 5.7 centimeters per decade. So almost all of this apparent sea level rise, which Sophie is reporting, is actually due to the land sinking. This whole story from a climate scientist at the University of Arizona and the Washington Post is complete nonsense. The land sinking doesn't have anything to do with climate change or the type of vehicle people are driving, but rather it has to do with other physical factors. If you look at tide gauges with the longest records in the world, like this one in Germany, we can see that sea level is rising at the same rate now as it was 180 years ago. In fact, the rate of sea level rise there peaked around the year 1920. And it's pretty much the same story in the Netherlands, the same rate of sea level rise for 170 years. At locations where the land is rising, like Sweden, the apparent sea level rise is negative. Every year it's a longer walk to the beach for Greta because the land in Sweden is rising, and thus the beaches are actually getting larger. There's no story here. It's just the usual junk science and misinformation from academia, the press, and certain members of the public. The problem these locations are having has nothing to do with climate and nothing to do with fossil fuels. Sea level has been rising for 20,000 years since the end of the last ice age. From 14,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, sea level rose more than 100 meters. It only takes a few minutes to explain these simple concepts. But people like Sophie just aren't hearing them. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on the climate scam for 16 years. You can visit him and his family on the web at realclimatescience.com.